8 years ago, David and I stood among the ruins of Ephesus, amazed by the vastness of the ancient city. The massive facade of the Celsus Library still intact, towering over Taurus. A significant portion of the great theater still stands, where once 25,000 could be seated. We toured the excavation of ancient apartments full of mosaics indicating the wealth of the city. And nearby, an incredible pillar left from the ancient wonder, the Temple of Artemis, stands vaulting into the Turkish sky. As Reverend Stephen mentioned last week, the city of Ephesus was a center of Paul's missionary activity. The Apostle Paul was an urban evangelist in Jerusalem, Thessalonica, Philippi, Antioch, Corinth, Rome, and Ephesus, the capital of Rome's proconsular Asia. To these people, Paul pointedly proclaimed Christ crucified, teaching that sinners are justified by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and reconciled to God. Through Christ, sins are forgiven, and his grace restores unity to everything. When human behavior is conformed to Christ's example, Paul exhorted, reconciliation with one another is possible. In this way, faithful people participate in the coming kingdom of God. With Christ's imminent return, Jews and Gentiles alike were urged to believe in Jesus Christ and live lives worthy of God's merciful love. The epistle to the Ephesians greatly influenced Christian thought and spirituality over the centuries. It is theologically dense, with language described as luxuriant, beautiful, and rich. The author of Ephesians writes about a dualistic world dominated by spirits of light and darkness, the mystery of salvation, the church as a sacrament, and Christ's unifying grace. While many consider Ephesians the pinnacle of Pauline thought, the author of this magnificent writing probably wasn't Paul. The grammatical structure and language of Ephesians is distinctly different from that of Paul's undisputed works. There are no details of Paul's previous dealings with the Christians in Ephesus or affection for members of that community. And significantly, Paul's theology of the cross, so fundamental to his proclamation, isn't the emphasis in Ephesians. Instead, the epistle emphasizes the saving action of Christ through a unified church. It's likely that one of Paul's best disciples wrote the epistle to the Ephesians, a skillful writer, a generation later, who further developed Paul's theology as the imminent return of Christ was delayed. Associating Paul's name with it gave the epistle gravitas in the early fledgling church. Today's reading from Ephesians leads us to consider the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles in this early church. The cities that Paul evangelized all had Jewish communities situated amongst polytheistic non-Jews or Gentiles. As recorded in the book of Acts, some Jewish Christians thought that access to Christ necessarily came through the Jewish tradition by Gentiles first becoming Jews. Quarrels arose over circumcision, what foods could be eaten, marriage between believers and Gentiles, and other practices that distinguished the Jews. Remember that the Sinai covenant created a boundary around the people of Israel. The law its commandments and ordinances, deliberately set them apart from other people. This separation, the Jewish boundary of holiness and purity, was exemplified in the physical boundary at the temple in Jerusalem. There, the holy place was separated from the court of the Gentiles by a wall. The holy place, accessible to Jews only, was where the presence of God was. On the wall that separated the holy place from the court of the Gentiles, there was a sign throughout the wall threatening Gentiles who trespassed. One limestone tablet from the temple, now in the Israeli Museum, reads, "No foreigner may enter within the balustrade around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught, on himself shall he put blame for the death which will ensue." It's not that there was a problem with the Torah or even the temple. That wall and its various warnings became a symbol of human separation and hostility. Paul did not think it was necessary to become Jewish in order to be Christian or to receive Christ's grace. This led him to strongly argue that there was neither Jew nor Greek. The Jewish Jesus was all for all. Now, listen to the relationship between Jews and Gentiles a generation after Paul, as described in Ephesians. "For Jesus Christ is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall. That is the hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of two." The author of Ephesians drastically restructures these symbols of separation by the figure of the crucified Christ. The author of the epistle lives in a time when Jesus Christ has created a new multi-ethnic community of believers that includes Jews and Gentiles. Through his death on the cross, Jesus brought hostility to an end. His blood is the new bond of unity for all. In that, Jesus is not just the revelation of God's grace, but the model for a new humanity. A humanity where we live beyond hostility into unity. Ephesians calls us to examine whether we are striving towards unity. In all of us, there is tension between the human inclination towards hostility and our yearning for peace. So in these great green growing days of summer, take some time to reflect on the power of Christ's Spirit working in you. How are you nurturing relationships? Are you building walls? Do you expect that someone who disagrees with you might still have good intent? Are you reaching past cultural boundaries in love? How do you respond to people who are different than you? With judgment or with curiosity? How are you striving for unity in this, our beloved community of faith? What an appropriate time for this passage to be read as we begin to come together again in worship and fellowship, and as our world continues to struggle so desperately for peace. Hostility and division continue to be part of the human condition, of our sinfulness. Yet the epistle to the Ephesians tells us that the power of Christ is greater than any differences we have. So how will we, in our time, be people who are unified by the peace of Jesus Christ? It is written, "In him the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for our God